It was the 14th of March, a Tuesday, and the sky that morning was the color of a wet nickel, low and flat, with a wind coming off the ridge that got under your collar no matter which way you turned. I remember it exact because that was the day I stood at the back of the county auction room in my good coat, the one I only wear to funerals and closings, and raised my hand for a piece of ground nobody else in that room would touch. There were maybe 30 people there. 29 of them were waiting on the good parcels, the flat bottomland out by the highway. One of them was me, 63 years old, waiting on the lot everybody had already written off. When the clerk called out 58 acres, the old Harlan place, briars and locust, and a hillside that hadn't grown a paying thing in 40 years, a fellow near the front laughed. Not mean. Just tired. The way a man laughs at somebody about to make a mistake he's too polite to stop. He said out loud, "To nobody. You know that's a goat lot, right?" Meaning it wasn't good for anything but goats, and maybe not even them. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The auction. My hand in the air, and that flat laugh still hanging over the folding chairs. I paid $411 an acre for ground the county had failed to move at auction 3 separate times over 11 years. $23,838 all told, for 58 acres of what everybody agreed was nothing. I want you to understand I did not raise my hand because I was brave. I raised it because of a thing my grandmother had written in a ledger 60-some years before, a thing I had read so many times. The page had gone soft as cloth, and because I had finally at 63 gotten too old to keep pretending I didn't believe her. The county had tried to sell that hillside since before my knees went bad. It was land that had beaten everybody who ever fooled with it. The Harlans farmed it 2 generations and gave up. A fellow from out of state bought it in the 70s, meaning to run cattle and put in a pond, and he hired a dozer man to cut roads across the slope. And the first hard rain took his roads and half his topsoil down into the county road ditch, and he let it go back to the county for the taxes. After that, it just sat. Briars came in first, then the locust, then the multiflora rose that the extension office had told everybody to plant back in the 50s. By the time I bought it, you could not walk a straight line across that place. You could not see the ground for the thorns. The soil map at the courthouse had it marked as severe erosion hazard, slope 18 to 30%, and a note somebody had typed decades ago that said, "Not suited to cultivation." Everybody saw a problem, but my grandmother had not seen a problem. That was the whole of it, and I did not understand it for most of my life. She had a ledger, a real one, black cloth cover gone gray at the corners, and in it she kept everything, the weather and the prices and who owed what. And in among all of it, on a page dated the autumn of 1951, she wrote, "The ground don't hide what it's got. It just waits for somebody slow enough to notice." That was it. The ground don't hide what it's got. It just waits for somebody slow enough to notice. I read that line the first time when I was maybe 12 going through her things after she passed, and I thought it was just an old woman being fond of herself. I read it again in my 30s and thought it was pretty. I read it in my 60s sitting at my kitchen table the week before that auction, and I finally understood she had been telling me exactly what to do, and I had spent 50 years being too fast to notice. Because there was more on that page. And this is the part that took me half a lifetime to trust. My grandmother had written in that same steady hand about her own grandmother, who had come into this country when there wasn't a store within 2 days' ride, and who kept hogs. Not a few, a herd. And she did not fence them tight and feed them corn the way we learned to do later. She turned them out onto the rough ground, the ground nobody else would farm, and she let them work it. My grandmother wrote it down like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Hogs on the hillside 2 seasons, she wrote, and the 3rd season it come up in clover where clover never was, and the old spring run again. The old spring run again. I did not know what spring she meant. I did not know if it was true, or just a story that had softened in the telling across 4 generations of women writing to each other. But I knew that hillside, and I knew that no machine in 80 years had done anything to it but make it worse. Now I want to tell you about the delay, because I am not going to stand here and pretend I read that ledger and marched out to buy a mountain. I sat on it for 11 years. 11 years. I watched the county fail to sell it 3 times, and each time I thought about my grandmother's line, and each time I found a reason. I was too old. I did not have the money to lose. Everybody would laugh. What finally moved me was not courage. It was my husband, Dell, who is not a man of many words and has never once in 41 years told me I was wrong when I wasn't. I told him about the ledger one night at the table, feeling foolish saying it out loud, and I braced for him to be kind about it. He just chewed a while and said, "Well, how many hogs did the old woman run?" That was all. He didn't tell me it was smart or crazy. He asked a practical question, the way you'd ask about anything you meant to actually do. And something about the plainness of it made me feel like maybe it wasn't a dream after all. Maybe it was just a job of work that nobody had bothered to do in a long time. So the spring after I bought it, I walked it. Not to clear it, just to read it, the way my grandmother said. Took a walking stick and a 50-foot tape and a little notebook, and I gave myself the whole of April to just look. That is a hard thing to do when you own a thing that everybody says is worthless. You want to prove them wrong by Tuesday. I made myself go slow. I made myself stand still on that slope for a measured 10 minutes at a stretch, watching where the water wanted to go, where the briars grew thickest and where, in odd bare patches, they grew not at all. And here's what I found by standing still, down toward the bottom of the North Draw, in a place so choked with rose and locust. You could not have driven a goat through it. The ground was wet, not muddy from rain. There was a soft seep, no bigger than a kitchen table, where the water came up cold, even on a warm day, and it made a little dark line down the draw for maybe 40 feet before the briars swallowed it. The old spring, it had not gone anywhere. It had just been buried under 80 years of trouble, and the trouble was drinking it before it could ever run. That was the day I understood the thing my grandmother meant, the difference between a problem and a resource, which is only ever the difference between whether or not you have learned to read the ground. That hillside was not eroded because it was bad ground. It was eroded because it was rich ground that had been abandoned. All that thorn and locust was growing on soil that wanted to grow things. And that spring was not a wet nuisance in a briar patch. It was water, clean and constant. The whole slope had been keeping secret from everybody too fast to stand still and feel the cold of it. The ground don't hide what it's got. It just waits, I want to be honest that understanding the idea and doing the work are two different animals, and the work is where most people quit. It was not a trick, turning hogs out on that hill. It was a system, and it had tolerances, and if I got them wrong, I would either do nothing or do harm. You cannot just dump a herd of hogs on a hillside and walk off. Left too long in one place, hogs will tear ground down to bare dirt, and then that dirt will wash. And I would have proved every doubter right, made the erosion worse than the county ever did. The whole art of it. The thing my great-great-grandmother knew and never had to write down because she lived, was in the timing and the moving. You put them where the trouble is thickest. You let them root and grub and eat the rose roots and the locust seedlings and turn the sod, and then, before they overwork it, you move them. The answer was direction and timing, knowing which 40 feet of that slope needed working this week, and which needed to be left alone to rest and heal and seed itself back. Fast would ruin it. So I built for it, and I built it cheap, because that is how I was raised. I did not buy fine equipment. I bought 40 rolls of electric net fencing, the kind you can pick up and move at $94 a roll, and a solar charger to run it. And I got most of my posts and my water lines second-hand off a fellow 2 counties over. I started with 14 hogs, 14, not 40, a mixed lot of a hardy old breed with a black hide that holds up to sun. Animals that would rather work a woodlot than lay in a wallow, bought as feeder pigs at $55 a head. $770 in hogs. I laid out my first paddock at the top of the North Draw, a 1/4 acre, no bigger, right in the worst of the rows, and on the 11th of May I turned those 14 hogs into it, and I stood at the fence and watched. They did not know what to do at first. And then one old sow put her nose down and hit a rose root and pulled, and the others saw, and inside an hour that 1/4 acre was a churning brown business of grunting and rooting, and I stood there in the flat orange evening light with my hand on a locust post, and I thought, all right, Grandma. All right. Let's see. I moved them every 4 days. At first, then every 3, when I learned to read how fast they worked. A 1/4 acre, 4 days, then forward down the draw into the next 1/4 acre, while the first one lay open and raw behind them. And I will tell you, the raw ground scared me. It looked like exactly the disaster everybody predicted. Bare, torn, the rose roots pulled up and drying in windrows like something dead. My neighbor Carl, who runs cattle the ordinary way on the flat land I could not afford, drove his truck up my new track one Sunday in June and sat with his elbow out the window looking at that torn hillside for a long minute, and he said, in the mildest voice, "You sure about this?" Not mean. Carl is not a mean man. Just doubtful the way the whole county was doubtful, and I did not have anything to show him yet. But ruin. I said I wasn't sure of anything, which was true, and he nodded and drove back down, and I felt the doubt of it settle on me all evening. Then the county came, which I should have expected. A young woman from the Soil and Water District, badge on a lanyard, clipboard, drove up in a white truck the 2nd week of July, because somebody and I have my ideas. She was polite, and she was worried. And I could not blame her, because she was standing at the top of a torn-up hillside above a coney road, and everything she had been trained to see told her I was making a catastrophe. She talked about slope and about disturbed soil, and about whether I had a nutrient management plan, and she asked, careful, whether I understood the erosion hazard rating on this parcel. I told her I did. I told her I had read the same soil map she had. And then I did the only thing I could think to do, which was walk her back up the draw to the first paddock, the one I had opened up in May, 2 months healed now. And that was where the argument changed, because I could not have argued her out of anything. But the ground could. That first quarter-acre, torn to ruin in May, had come up in June rain thick with something green, not weeds, volunteer clover and native grass, seed that had been in that soil for 80 years waiting under the thorns for light and open ground. It was knee-high and holding the slope, roots knitting the dirt the hogs had loosened. She stood there and looked at the raw new paddock below and the healing paddock above, side by side the disaster and the recovery, and she did not say much. She wrote some things down. That was the summer I nearly quit. I am going to tell you about that night, because it would be a lie to leave it out. It was late August, hot and dry, no rain for 3 weeks, and the new paddocks weren't greening up the way the early ones had, because the soil was too parched to sprout what the hogs turned. I stood at the fence in the dark with the dry ground crunching under my boots, and I thought, you old fool. You have spent your money and your one good summer proving a story your grandmother copied from her grandmother, and maybe it worked once in 18 and something, when the whole world was different, and here you are at 63 tearing up a hillside on the word of a dead woman's ledger. I went inside, and I got the ledger down off the shelf, and I read that page again by the kitchen light. The ground don't hide what it's got. It just waits for somebody slow enough to notice. And I read the next line too, the one I hadn't leaned on before, where she'd written, dry years and wet years. The hogs don't hurry, and neither should you. Dry years and wet years, she had seen dry Augusts. And they had not quit, because the work was not measured in one dry August. It was measured in seasons, in the slow turning of a whole place. I put the ledger back. I did not move the hogs the next day the way I'd planned. I let them rest. I let the ground rest. I decided to trust the slow of it, because slow was the whole point. And if I hurried, I was no better than the dozer man who lost his topsoil in a single rain. The rain came the second week of September, 3 inches over 2 days, soft and long, and it did not wash. That was the thing. It did not wash. All that ground the hogs had loosened, and the clover had knitted. It held the water instead of shedding it, and it drank it down. And I walked the draw a week after that rain, down to where the buried spring had been, just a wet spot in the briars, and the briars were gone, worked out by the hogs, and the locust seedlings that had been drinking the water dry, and there was water standing clear in a little pool the size of a wagon, and below it a thread of it running, actual running water. Down the draw over clean gravel the hogs had exposed. The old spring run again. I did not feel like celebrating. I felt like something my grandmother had trusted me to carry had finally come to rest. Word of the water got around before I said anything to anybody the way things do in a county this size. And in the spring of the second year, the neutral party came, which is a thing I want to describe carefully, because it is where the doubt of the whole county ran into a fact it could not talk its way around. The state came out, a hydrogeologist, a young man with a truck full of instruments, and a manner that made it plain he did not expect to be impressed by a woman running hogs on a goat lot. He had been sent partly on account of the Soil and Water District's file, and partly because a spring reappearing on a slope that the map said had no reliable water was, in his words, unusual enough to look at. He put a flow meter in the run. It tested the water, dissolved oxygen and temperature, and nitrates, and the nitrates came back low, cleaner than the water in the county wells, which surprised him. He measured the flow at just under 4 gallons a minute. Steady, cold, 52 degrees, on the warmest day. A temperature that told him it was true, groundwater coming up from deep and not just runoff pooling. He looked at the soil, and he dug in it with a little steel probe. And I watched his face change when he saw how deep the dark crumb of it went now where 2 years before it had been a thin skin over clay. He asked me a lot of questions, and I told him plain what I had done, the hogs and the moving and the timing, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "The thing I will keep." He said, "I've got instruments in that draw that cost more than your whole herd, and none of them can tell me how to do what you did." He said it flat. He said, "The machines we send out here would have made this worse." And then he asked, would I mind if he wrote it up? Carl came back that same spring. Saw the water, saw the clover where the rose had been, saw 14 hogs grown to a working herd of 30-some, on ground that fed them and healed at the same time. He leaned on my fence a while the way he does. He didn't apologize, and I didn't want him to. He just looked out over that green slope with the water running through it, and he said, "Well, I'll be." That was all. "Well, I'll be." And in this county, from a man like Carl, that is a great deal. That is nearly a speech. The numbers, since I promised to be honest and not to brag, are modest. Modest is the right word. In 3 years I turned 58 acres of unsellable briar into 38 acres of working pasture and woodland edge, with a live spring feeding a stock pond I never had to dig, and about 20 acres I have left. Rough on purpose, because the deer and the turkey want it, and because my grandmother would have known to leave something be. I run about 40 hogs now, and I sell them by the half to families that drive up my track on purpose, and I cleared. My 3rd year, a little over $19,000 above my costs. That does not make anybody rich, but I paid $23,000 for a thing the county called nothing, and now the Soil and Water District uses my hillside as a demonstration. And the young man from the state wrote it up in a report with my grandmother's name in it. Because I asked him to, and her grandmother's name too, as far back as the ledger knew it. That was the one thing I wanted out of it that wasn't money. I wanted those women's names written down somewhere official, saying they were right. But I am an old woman standing on a green hillside that everybody told me was a goat lot, and I have thought a good deal about what it all comes to, and it is not really about hogs. It is about the difference between fast and slow, and which one the ground answers to. Everybody who ever failed on this hill failed by hurrying. They dozed it, and it washed. They looked at it for an afternoon and decided what it was. My grandmother wrote that the ground don't hide what it's got. It just waits for somebody slow enough to notice. And I believe now she meant it as a whole way of living, not just a note about a hillside. The things worth having are mostly not hidden. They are just waiting on somebody patient enough to stand still and read them. I nearly wasn't that person. I sat on her ledger, 11 years, being too old and too scared and too busy, listening to men who laughed. And the only thing I did right in the end was decide to go slow and let a dead woman who never learned to hurry teach me how, and so I'll leave you with this. The same way she left it for me. Somewhere out there, you have got a piece of ground everybody's told you is worthless, a hillside or a habit or an old idea in a drawer that folks keep telling you to give up on. I'd like to know what yours is. Tell me in the comments about the thing you're being too slow with, or the thing you're finally ready to stand still and read. I'll be up here on my hill watching the water run.